Buenas, bienvenidos a este vídeo de unplandivino.net. Vamos a seguir con este taller sobre la atracción sexual y las emociones en torno a esas heridas que nos motivan, bueno, todo lo que hemos estado viendo antes. Y vamos a saludar de nuevo a Ana Pilar. ¿Qué tal por ahí? Si puedes decir algo.
Hola, buenas tardes. Muy interesante y para ir a profundidad con todo el material que estás compartiendo, Iván. Gracias.
Sí, bueno, ahora veremos. Y Claudia, ¿qué tal?
Hola, buenas tardes. Muy bien, Iván. Un gusto realmente compartir
De
esto.
Argentina, igualmente, gracias. Y Marisol, no sé si tendrá mucho lío en la casa, desde México.
No, ¿qué tal? Hola, buenos días, Iván. Hola, chicas. Gracias.
Venga, pues seguimos con esta otra parte de esta segunda parte de la sesión primera, que es así, es la parte 2 de la sesión 1 sobre la atracción sexual. Y vimos cómo eso, la masturbación muchas veces está causada por una emoción de tristeza, de soledad, de cosas así, ¿no? Por no sentirse querido, no haber sido queridos, todo eso. Bueno, y ahora vamos a ver las emociones en torno a la pornografía y cómo
to pornography. A lot of times pornography is actually about a person's sadness. This is why more men are involved in pornography than women generally. It's because more men carry a lot of sexual sadness than women do. Because men want to have sex more generally because they have less blockages to sex because of the multi-generational reasons. Multi-generational reasons of the blockage to sex, remember we talked about earlier with women, were things like how they've been abused, how they've been harmed, how sex has been used as a tool to hurt them, violence towards them as a gender and so forth, which causes blockages to sex. And then a lot of men feel the sadness that their partner or women around them are blocked to sex. And because of this sadness, they then look for a means to look at women who are not blocked to sex. Right? Unfortunately, many of those women are in a rage about sex, but that's a different thing. But they're less blocked to sex, and so pornography becomes a tool to use in order to feel excited sexually. Let's look at oral sex. What
ahí sería excitados los hombres, no excitadas.
would most of the taboos about oral sex be involved about, do you think?
It's not for procreation.
It's not for procreation, so should be wrong then, according to many religious movements. Can you see that a lot of oral sex, or the issues with oral sex, are going to be about bodily functions and actually not loving the genitalia, not loving genitals, but actually feeling an aversion to the genitals, to the smell, taste, and so forth of those functions too. So oral sex, we should say oral sex, I don't feel oral sex or masturbation is an injured thing unless there are certain things happening along with them. They're not injuries, they're just things that are taboos. So we remember here, we probably should change that heading. We weren't listing injuries here, we were listing taboos. Right? And these are all taboos. Yeah, that's better. So, but why would a person feel that oral sex is a taboo? Can you feel about what that would be emotionally? Katerina, if you just wait for the mic.
Because certain things go in certain places, like they're made, like the penis is made
penis
for the
should
vagina.
go in vagina,
exactly,
and nothing else.
Yeah.
Okay, which is also a reason why anal sex is a taboo then.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, let's look at oral sex, for example. Firstly, how is a woman's body made?
It's a fairly broad question.
In terms of sexually, if all pleasure of a woman's body happened internally, right, then it would make sense that sex is just about the penis going in the vagina. But the reality for women is that a lot of their pleasure doesn't happen just internally, does it? So you've got the clitoris as well, external to the body. So then does it make sense even from God's perspective that sex is penis in vagina? If a person has a sexual organ that's on the outside of their body and not on the inside, then how does the justification occur that it all has to happen inside? Obviously, there is no justification even from that perspective. So can you see how a lot of times we accept a sexual norm and then feel bad about or feel it's a taboo? We accept things just because of belief structures that aren't even grounded in any logic, are they? So, for example, the belief structure about masturbation, is it grounded in any logic? No. If you can't touch yourself, then who else should be able to touch it? Nobody. And if you can't touch yourself, then basically, and nobody else is allowed to touch you, then why was the sexual organ given to you in the first place by God? It makes no sense, does it? The same applies with things like oral sex. Like, you know, if sex is just going to happen inside your body and not outside of your body, then, and why would you have a sexual organ that responds to touch or to somebody's licking or something like that outside of your body? Doesn't make any sense, does it? Logically, doesn't make any sense. Celibacy is an interesting one for the same reason, isn't it? How can celibacy be holy when God, who created your body, created your sexual organs? Does that make any sense? It doesn't make any sense. So can you see that many of these things don't make sense as taboos? Then others, you can see why they have taboos associated with them. But some of them, you can't even really see why there are any taboo associated with them.
Could we talk maybe, babe, about the the specific emotions that might lead us to be attracted to these things that are not really related to sex? So some of these aversions to these things are related to shame about our sexual organs that have been imposed upon us. But
well, let's look at even celibacy from that perspective. Why would I be attracted to celibacy? What emotions would cause me to be attracted to celibacy as a way of life? Let's use the microphones. You can go first.
Denial. It feels like denial.
Denial? Denial of what?
Of my feelings, denial of myself, denial of my urges.
Denial of sexual desire.
Yes.
so shame might cause me to deny my sexual desire.
Yeah.
What else might?
What else might?
Just uncomfortable with it that makes me want to not deal with it at all and focus on being holy.
Right. So not wanting to deal with any sexual desires.
Because I don't want to be sinful.
Don't want to be
Sinful.
sinful.
Okay, a definition of sinfulness, yes. I have a big inside of me a definition of what's sinful, what isn't, and as a result of that, feel that celibacy is my course of action. Anything else?
I can think that
I can think of quite a lot more, actually.
a fear of emotional intimacy.
Fear of emotional intimacy, big one, or fear of sexual intimacy, two big ones, yes. Any more?
Being disillusioned with
Being
sex? Being disillusioned.
disillusioned with relationships, yes, yep, very good. And therefore having a lot of grief about relationships, yep.
Feeling inadequate sexually, and so wanting to just shut down.
Yes,
completely.
feeling that you're not sexually powerful and therefore you'd rather have no sex at all and then call that a place that's holy. Yeah. And
A belief in purifying through punishment.
yes,
Self-punishment.
the way I become holy is by sacrificing myself, by sacrificing some of my desires.
Fear of being rejected?
Yes, fear of being rejected definitely is celibacy. And keep going, there's some more. Well, why do you think the priesthood created celibacy?
I was going to say something else.
Go and say something.
So within having sex, you are without protection.
Right.
And
So
that you're exposed to whatever judgment and to harm.
So it's a desire for control?
Sorry?
A desire for control?
No. The other way around. When I'm exposed to the possibility or the opportunity of being harmed.
Yes.
Via a judgment. And I'm naked in that moment. And when I'm naked, I have no protection. And when the other one is going, I'm not protected against any
Which
judgment.
is a desire to control.
To control, if I become celibate,
I'm now controlling all of my
the possibility of being harmed.
There's no possibility.
Sorry, I'm not that.
It's okay. It's okay.
I can't follow right now.
Yeah. The question I asked just earlier was,
So
why did the priesthood create celibacy for themselves? Why did they do that? There's an emotional reason. Nico?
To keep the men pure from women.
Yes.
Because women are lower than men.
So a fear of women is one. So a fear of the opposite gender is a major reason for celibacy. A fear of the opposite gender having control of you. Yeah. That's quite a few emotional injuries in one particular thing, isn't it? Can you see that? Just all these different emotions that actually generate a particular course of action. Right. Let's choose another one, shall I?
Let's choose something particularly, for example, S&M and bondage.
Okay, let's choose that. S&M and bondage.
What
might cause us to want to be involved in practices where pain is involved to heighten sexual desire, in other words. So in other words, sexual desire is heightened while I'm in pain.
Maybe being punished in childhood?
Yes, being punished by the opposite gender parent certainly can create that.
So why does that create a sexual...
Well, when I'm punished by the opposite gender parent and feel that that's love, now I've got some, I'm going to have some issues about what surrounds love and sex as a result.
Or if someone is in a state of numbness.
And only pain opens
yeah, exactly.
their...
They need a very intense physical experiences to feel something.
To feel something, yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Yep. Why would they be in a state of numbness sexually, aside from what would be the underlying emotional reason for that?
I believe fear or being harmed or anger.
Yeah, or what about even a desire to associate violence with sex, right? Rather than associate loving kindness with sex. Right. In other words, kindness turns them off.
Yeah.
Why would kindness turn you off? Okay. Sorry.
When you've been treated really unlovingly as a child, and perhaps had sexual injury through an adult or a powerful person in your life.
Certainly. Now, we're not saying, what we're saying here is this is not an exhaustive list of the injuries associated with one of these particular things. That it is just an example of some of the injuries associated with a certain practice. Does that make sense? So this is about being open enough to investigate these things.
And very often it is about a sadness or a pain that has occurred in our childhood that was not in a sexual context, but because we carry that and associate that with love or intimacy or closeness, then what appears to be a huge sexual injury is created when really the thing to heal is a pain within childhood. Yeah.
Can I give an example of this? Let's say a man is attracted to S&M. In other words, he's attracted to a woman punishing him and he gets sexually turned on as a result, right? And so he's attracted to a woman doing that. Now, can you see there must be an underlying, there can be an underlying emotional injury where his mother has already punished him or rejected him. And so he feels an association between the rejection, and that opens him up sexually. So when he's being rejected, he opens up sexually. When he's not being rejected, he closes down sexually. Remember I said that all the sexual feelings, and this is something to remember right from the beginning of our discussion, that they are within us, passing through us. And it happens through the opening of the particular chakra. Remember, we talked about that. So imagine if the man was only then attracted to a woman who was punishing and rejecting. So as long as the woman is rejecting him, he feels sexually attracted, right? And if she's rejecting him during the sex act, he even feels more excited then, right? But as soon as she stops rejecting him in the sex act, in other words, having some form of physical pain or punishment associated with it, now this energy is not passing through him anymore, so he's now blocked. He's now blocked sexually, and he feels like he needs the S&M practice in order to open up sexually again. Genesis?
I think you've said it, but I want to state also that I think that if there is no emotional association between a certain type of behavior from the mother or from the parent generally, so probably the person won't partner trade off some emotions to flow. I don't know if I say it correctly.
So you're saying that if emotions were denied during the child's development,
if a child is being abused,
yes,
all right, and thinks that that's the way that mommy or daddy loves me,
yes,
there's no association about joyful behavior towards the child.
Yep.
So it associates love, sex with abusive behavior.
Yes.
So it can trade off its emotions with that kind of behavior.
Yes.
Towards him or her towards others.
So it feels sexual.
Y se refiere a intercambiar, no a compensar, creo más bien. Pero también un sentido de compensar puede ser. Sí, como que las mezcla, ¿no? Estas emociones con ese tipo de comportamiento hacia él, o de él, o de ella hacia otros.
Actually turned on by that kind of behaviour rather than any other form, because the injury is that when that kind of behaviour is given to me, then I feel open emotionally.
And the numbness that Nicole said earlier comes from when I have like a good behaviour towards me, that doesn't turns me on, or that sets me down actually, so I become numb. But when someone shouts or behaves bad at me, or I behave bad at someone, so that turns,
feel more emotionally connected. Yeah. Can you also, what about on the giving side? So we talked a lot about the receiving side of the S&M, but what about the giving? There's somebody doing the whipping and there's somebody doing, what are they feeling? What's their emotions do you feel that they're in denial of?
I think with sadism, it's a revenge for things happened to them before.
Yes, the feeling of revenge is one of the emotions, yes, towards the gender that it's aimed towards.
And so what's under that feeling of revenge?
Under the feeling of revenge?
Yeah.
Could be that their opposite gender parent has treated them badly, or treated their mother badly, treated the same gender as themselves badly, and so they then feel like they want some kind of, they only feel powerful sexually when they're connected with this feeling of a revengeful act towards the opposite gender.
So in order to heal that, person would need to connect to deep feelings of powerlessness and grief.
Yeah. So remember that many of these actions that we view as taboos are actually based around addictions. They are actually addictions so that we open sexually. And sexual addictions are very powerful because they are sexual in nature, and sex is a very strong feeling inside of our body. And so what happens is we finish up engaging in the addiction that opens us up sexually without dealing with the emotion that shut us down sexually. Does that make sense? So instead, what we're going for is the addiction that opens us sexually in order to avoid the emotion that shut us down. So in the case if I've been treated badly by the opposite gender parent, I then might feel a degree of rage and anger about that. When I can begin to express that rage and anger towards the opposite gender, or feel a feeling of control towards the opposite gender, now that's my addiction being met. Now I open up sexually as a result of that addiction being met. But if the opposite gender did the same to me, I would be even more enraged and therefore close down, maybe even close down myself even further as a result. You know, so if this is where usually you find with S&M type practices, one person. It's very rare to have one person who engages in both the overt and the
submissive
behaviour rather than the dominating behaviour. So usually one person will either engage in the dominating behaviour and not the submissive, or vice versa, engage in the submissive behaviour but never the dominating behaviour. And the reason why is because of two completely separate injuries based upon interactions with their parents.
You just said it. It's all about control. The dominatrix feels she has control over the dominant, so
it's about sexual control, isn't it? Over
safety. Safety. I'm not afraid of you.
Yes,
I can
safety.
control you.
Yeah,
that's it.
I'm safe. You're not. You know, that kind of feeling is there as well. Yes. Anything else you can think of on the dominating side? Can you see how it's working through? Like, it's not. I wouldn't call it working through the emotion. It's living in the unhealed state, but needing the unhealed state to open yourself up sexually that causes the attraction to different practices. The key is to not condemn the practice. You see, by making them a taboo, we condemn the practice. When we condemn the practice, or when people generally condemn the practice, we now stop the openness to actually addressing the emotional injuries that create a practice that's unloving.
Yeah, perhaps I would like to say to not condemn the desire. Some of the practices I feel are very harmful and I would never condone the practice, but to not condemn the desire is a very important thing, because unless you're willing to examine the desire, you can't heal it. Yeah.
So the key is to not condemn the desire. But you don't have to act upon the desire.
Exactly.
Right? What we need to do instead is feel the underlying emotion that creates the desire. That's what we need to do.
Because if we keep in mind that the pure state is sex with my soulmate.
In whatever form that may take. But obviously, even if that takes an SMN type form, then obviously there are still emotions to deal with, because one is dominating and one is submissive. And does that sound like to you like a healed sexual relationship? No, it's not. So it's not yet healed. We don't condemn the fact that it's like that. What we do is we go through the process of working through the emotions to heal it. That's what we do instead. If we want to be at one with God, that's what we do. If we want to be at one with God, we will always look at the practice, whatever the practices are, and we'll examine them completely from a position of love. So we'll ask ourselves, well, is it right for me if I'm addicted to dominating Mary sexually and whipping her, and I'm addicted to that, and I can't even connect with any orgasmic feelings within myself unless those particular things are happening to Mary? If that's the case, then is that loving for myself or Mary? Surely not. Surely I should be able to connect to feelings, sexual feelings, and my own orgasm when we're in a loving exchange without me or her dominating the exchange. So we need to question ourselves rather than justify the behaviour. See, what most people on the planet do with all of these taboos is we become what I would call rebellious about them. Do you know what I mean by that? We basically say, well, yes, I am involved with S&M, and it's okay for me to be involved in S&M, and I'm not actually saying it's not okay, because at the end of the day, you know, you have free will and you can do anything you like. Even if it is damaging to another person, you can still do it. I'm not saying that you haven't got free will, but what I'm saying is that we do need, if we want to be ever at one with God and ever at one with our soulmate, we do need to address the unbalanced desires that are out of harmony with love in the process. Eagle, thanks. There's a lot of spirits at the moment projecting at the group about, can we really say these things?
Yeah, there's a lot of like, whoa, they're really talking about that.
You know, can we really say that S&M is bad, for example? And I'm not saying it's bad or good, because to me that's a judgment. What I'm saying is there are emotional injuries involved in the S&M practices. And if we're willing and open, we can see those emotional injuries and address them. We don't need to condemn them. We need to address them. Right? We don't need to judge them. We need to address them. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you, just answered the question.
Yeah.
I just wanted to probably use another whiteboard and list at one with God sexual practices. The good ones, because we...
At one with God sexual practices. Okay. The problem with doing that is that it then seems like a whole heap of rules about what are the proper sexual practices. My suggestion, instead of doing that, is to start questioning whether love is involved in any sexual interaction. You see, a soulmate couple that has unhealed emotions can certainly still engage in unhealed sexual practices. So you can be in a relationship with your soulmate and still have sexual practices that need to be healed. Do you follow me? And the key is to allow yourself to feel the lack of love in these things. Now, if you have a desire for God, you will always eventually progress towards God, and anything that causes you to stagnate in your progress towards God obviously needs to be healed. And sexual practices can certainly cause your stagnation in your progression towards God. This is why some of the people who believe holiness and celibacy are coexisting, is because many of the times they got to a certain point where their sexual practices were not harmonious with getting closer to God, and so they threw away all sexual practices. And they got a bit closer to God because they dealt with some emotions in that process, but unfortunately they can't ever be at one with God in that case. So while you're practicing celibacy, for example, this is going to be a very strong statement for many of our spirit friends, you will never be at one with God practicing celibacy. Except under one condition. And that is if it's impossible for you to have sexual interaction with your soulmate. But you still wouldn't be practicing celibacy as a practice. You'd still have a desire for your soulmate. Right? So and the reality is you'll never be at one with God by forcing yourself into a state of celibacy. Right? So celibacy is stopping you at one with God as much as S&M bondage practices will stop you at one with God. The reason why these stop you at one with God is because there is the domination over somebody else who's submissive. Now, obviously, that's not an act of love. To dominate and be submissive, both conditions are not an act of love. You know, we will join together equally when we're in an act of love. So an S&M practice, while we may be engaged in it, it's up to you whether you engage in it, but at the end of the day, it will prevent your at one with God as much as the practice of celibacy will. That's the irony, right?
Is it as much as?
Yeah. Well, it
Iván,
is at one point, sooner or later, if I continue.
Esto me llama la atención con una parte que hablaron que mencionó Mari de el deseo, o sea que en esta experiencia física, que el deseo también es el que nos va a mover, ¿no? En la unión con Dios, o sea, el deseo, y que generalmente es mejor ser un activo negativo a ser un pasivo o un tibio, ¿no? Porque no te está moviendo el deseo. Y que cuando llegas a planos espirituales es como más difícil conectar o vincular toda esta parte. Estás tan desvinculado de ti mismo por esa tibieza que no logras como ir ascendiendo. Y esa parte me llamó mucho la atención y ahorita me hizo recordar con esto que menciona en cuanto al celibato, ¿no? Esta parte como de negar totalmente el deseo y es como una tibieza que al final pues te va estancando y también me llama la atención que, o sea, que toda la experiencia humana es tan rica para ascender, ¿no? En toda esta actividad y esta experiencia que vamos teniendo, al final, pues nunca es negada, no es negada y esa parte también es como, me llama mucho la atención también.
Es el deseo del celibato también es un deseo. O sea, en muchos momentos de nuestra vida nos hubiéramos ahorrado muchas desarmonías si hubiéramos ejercido ese deseo, por ejemplo, o sea, si hubiéramos tenido ese deseo, aunque sea desarmónico, aunque sea una mala motivación, el decir, nada, ya no quiero y venga de una venganza o venga de lo que... Sin embargo, como que para priorizar y esas cosas, y ya lo ha dicho Miller, ¿no? Que la gente se puede meter en el celibato y en ese proceso sanar algunas cosas, pero si se encasquillan ahí, pues mal.
Ok, sí.
O sea, si tú la has asociado con la tibieza, pero fíjate, ¿no?
Sí.
La cantidad de fuerza de voluntad que puede hacer falta a veces, y cuando son jóvenes mucha más, para priorizar. Lo malo es que ese deseo que puede ser puro, lo capturan, digamos, las instituciones diferentes, mundanas, las iglesias o lo que sea, ¿no? Y lo meten en sus coordenadas, ¿no? Para servirles.
Sería, como dices, detectar la pureza del deseo. Si no se vuelve una adicción por ocultar alguna emoción ahí o persiguiendo alguna emoción,
sí,
a un deseo puro, ¿no?
Claro. Y fíjate cómo lo cierran en una adicción muchas iglesias porque ya el presupuesto es que no hay alma gemela y el sexo da igual y cosas así. Sí. En muchas
Iván,
sí.
yo en ese momento que preguntaron por el celibato, yo cuando él relacionó esto de la iglesia, bueno, de por qué la religión impuso, digamos, esa condición, pensé justamente en esto, de alguna manera, y asocié con lo que dijo Jesús, que bueno, la mediumnidad fue dada a todos los hijos de Dios por igual, y bueno, la comunicación con espíritus y esto que de alguna manera estaba condenado, pero que a su vez es favorecido al estar condenado, como vemos con la sexualidad, de alguna manera la influencia generaba esto, la reunión álmica, el poder que hablábamos, porque del propósito justamente tan amoroso, como que general, claro, de que no consumemos ese nivel de armonía, hablo, al evitar la reunión álmica, en este caso dentro de la misma iglesia, por decirte, porque bueno, anulan la otra mitad, anulan la posibilidad de que esto esté enmarcado en una relación con Dios verdadera, por decir.
Sería como intentar, fíjate qué gracioso, entre comillas gracioso, sería como intentar hacer incesto con Dios. Es decir...
Claro, algo así veo. Sí, exacto, como que...
Eso es a donde vas.
Sí, vi la perversión en anular la otra mitad, porque cuando él preguntó, yo sentí eso, que era un mecanismo de privar, justamente.
Al no saber estas cosas de las emociones de alma gemela, sería confundirlas con las emociones hacia Dios, hacia los hermanos humanos, hacia todos en general.
Sí,
claro,
porque lo pones a liderar.
La gemela con Dios, al confundir el alma gemela con Dios, es como, la iglesia es como la gran prostituidora, y muchas iglesias lo son, la relación con Dios porque quiere hacer incesto con Dios, claro, ahí está, qué fuerte.
Sí, yo sentí que era justamente una maniobra bastante, porque yo dije, wow, y lo sentí cuando hizo la respuesta y por ahí yo me quedé callada para ver qué respondían y bueno, después me fui, lo perdí. Y ahora recuerdo, gracias a esto que dice Marisol, de alguna forma me reanimó esto, porque yo entendí que justamente, y lo pones a liderar, digamos, como que ahí está, digamos, el representante de Dios en la tierra, y wow, como que, claro, o sea, como que de alguna forma es muy, muy agresivo, muy, la verdad, muy fuerte, sí. Muy violento.
No, imagínate, y tienes además luego, aparte hay que sumarle, pues eso, ¿no? La imagen y todas las emociones de todas las monjas, que tiene que ser un sacerdote el que oficie la misa.
Sí.
Todas sus emociones conscientemente de alma gemela. Sí, ostras, es una prostitución inmensa de Dios, ¿no? Porque es como usar a Dios, quitar el alma gemela y tener a miles de mujeres proyectando sobre los supuestos padres, que eso ya es una blasfemia enorme, ¿no? Es el llamarse padre de los sacerdotes. Joder, es que es súper satánico, es increíble.
Sí.
Visto con lo que nos están contando en la verdad divina, por lo menos. Qué fuerte. Bueno, habéis visto, ¿no? Es un momento muy gracioso, entre comillas también. Claro, María dice, no, pues tanto, o sea, ¿cómo son comparables el celibato y el sadomasoquismo? Pues ahora lo va a comentar más Miller. ¿Queréis comentar algo más? Seguimos.
You're practicing celibacy. At one point, I'm going to stagnate in my condition, and from that moment on, I am never going to become at one with God. Right? Now, that condition might be a bit higher than when I practice S&M bondage, but at the end of the day, they're still stagnant conditions. So they're just as bad as each other, preventing us from becoming at one with God, aren't they? If we're looking at our desire to become at one with God and at one with our soulmate, both practices will never allow us to become at one with God or at one with our soulmate. Both of them. Now, the earth has no judgment in holiness towards celibacy. In fact, they laud celibacy as holy. And yet when it comes to S&M bondage, they condemn that. And yet what I'm saying is both practices will inhibit your desire and longing to become at one with your soulmate and at one with God. Both practices.
Because they're both denial of emotion.
They're both denial of different emotions, and they're both denial of actual, the pure state, which is that state. Anything that denies that pure state is going to inhibit your at one with your soulmate and at one with God. Does that make sense to everyone? So this is what we need to consider, is that some of these things we condemn that, and yet celibacy we often just skip over, and yet the two practices from God's perspective will have just as much impact upon our becoming at one with God as each other.
I keep getting stuck on that point because I feel that S&M, I'm actively involved in harming another person, whereas celibacy, I'm harming my own sexual desire.
So what's the difference? Harming another person or harming yourself? Okay. Celibacy is harming your soulmate. Celibacy is also harming yourself.
Sure.
Both are harming in each case. Like so the reality is that both practices will stop you from becoming at one with God. Both practices will stop you from becoming at one with your soulmate. So both practices are just as stagnant as each other. They stagnate your progression just as much as each practice. So in the spirit world at the moment, in the sixth dimension, there are still many millions of spirits who believe totally in celibacy, that is the only way to connect to God. And what I'm saying to those spirits is, no, I'm sorry, but you are just as much in denial of you're of God and your soulmate in that state. As a person who practices bondage would be. That's what I'm saying. Is that pretty confronting or what? Right, if we can come over here and then up the back there. Thanks.
I was just wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit. Both these things to me are the extreme end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And you haven't really talked that much about normal day-to-day relationships, that most of us enjoy our sexuality and we're married or in good relationships. Or maybe some meet their soulmates later on in life, but happen to be married already by that time and have kids and families. Would you advise people like that to go for it and to try to be with the soulmates, or do you deny that and try to sublimate it into a different kind of love? Or what do you say to people who are in situations like that?
Can we cover this first and then
Yes.
get to that subject? Because we'd certainly like to cover that subject. So if you can remind me if we don't get to that subject within the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'd love to cover it.
To ask about incest and sex with children.
Yep.
And where does the law of attraction play a role here? Because with the other sexual practices that we're talking about, except sex with the dead and animals, where maybe there's no consent, we're talking about consent between adults mostly. But with children, I can't understand how does a child attract that?
A child attracts those kind of events through the unhealed emotions of its own parents. So it's its own parents in denial of unhealed emotions that attracts the events for the child. And this is the case for all things that children attract. So the reality is there is huge damage in pedophilia and incest. And the reason why there's huge damage in it is because not only does it not state the pure state, but also it actually is it is imposing an adult's will upon an undeveloped soul, a person who's yet to have the development of knowing what is, the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do, and it imposes upon them without their consent. And any time you impose something upon an adult without their consent, you're breaking laws of free will. But if you're imposing something upon a child, whether they give consent or not, you are actually breaking a lot of laws about whether the child's developed or not as well. So this is a very...
O sea, también quebrantando muchas leyes relativas al desarrollo, ¿no? O la naturaleza del desarrollo de la gente y de las almas.
Damaging action to do, certainly. The key with what we want to do, though, is we need to look at not condemning the desire. See, what we finish up doing is any person who has the desire for incest or desire for pedophilia, we eventually condemn them. Societally, what we do is we condemn them, we're very angry with them, and we do all sorts of things as a result to those particular people. What I'm suggesting is instead of doing that, we need to not condemn the desire, but rather the action is very, very damaging. We need to look at the desire. We need to examine why the desire is present, right? If we don't examine why the desire is present, the action will never change.
The desire will never change.
The desire will never change, and therefore they will want to act upon the desire. So what we want to do is look at the desire, acknowledge whenever it's present, look at the desire and start questioning why it exists.
The reason I wrote that on the board, actually, we were talking about taboo things sexually abhorrent to some people, is because I feel that because there is such shame and judgment of pedophilia, which I do feel is a horrible, abhorrent practice, but because there's so much judgment of people who practice pedophilia, they themselves are never encouraged to examine what the desire covers. And so the statistics for the healing of people who practice pedophilia are pretty horrible, because they don't really ever, there's very low statistics of people who ever stop having the desire to harm children in that way once they've started.
This is why they do it over and over and over again until they die. And it's only usually in the spirit world that, because of the openness of people assisting them, that they actually begin to address the emotional reason why they did so many terrible acts towards children. And the issue we need to face is not that we're not saying, myself and Mary are not saying that this isn't a major problem. It's a major problem on the earth. But what we're saying is every time we condemn in a person, even it's the reason for it occurring, the desire, we are actually stopping them. Societally, we are stopping them from ever healing their problem. We need to be able to discuss with them what the problem is all about emotionally and help them through the emotion that causes them to have a desire to have sex with children. That's what we need to do instead. And if that means isolating them from children until the desire is healed, then that's what we do. But we need to still go through the process of healing the desire. See, a lot of these different things are actually caused by unhealed desires, unhealed emotions. They're caused by emotions that are not even related to sex. And actually, some pedophilia-based emotions are not even related to sex. They are related to many other emotions. But we need to be open to seeing the desire and then addressing it and talking about it openly without condemnation and judgment. Because as soon as we judge the person, as soon as we condemn the person, from that moment on, they are unable to heal the emotion. From that moment on, they're going to hold on to the emotion, deny it. They'll even try to make out they don't have it when they still have it. And that's not going to get us anywhere when it comes to healing that sexually.
But in answer to your question, children don't have a law of attraction. It's based on their parents' law of attraction, and also it's based on the harm that individual is causing to do to children. Like they hold the ultimate responsibility for that. And then there's unhealed emotions within both parents that allow an open, that cause the lack of protection, if you like, for that child, for them then to be harmed.
So for many parents, they can't even recognise when their child has been sexually harmed just once. And the reason why they can't recognise it is because they themselves have emotional injuries that prevent the recognition of such harm. The truth is, when the parents are totally open emotionally and totally able to open sexually, they would instantly recognise even the danger before it occurred. They'd recognise the type of person who would be involved in sort of some kind of act of incest, and they would instantly take precaution with that particular person. But for the majority of us as parents, because we have different chains of our own and different histories of our own and so forth, and in particular, and this is why incest happens in a multi-generational sense, in particular, if I have been harmed sexually as a child and I deny this emotion within myself and I grow up to be an adult, there is usually only two particular paths I'm going to take. One path is to become a person who abuses children myself. The other part is to become a person who completely is unaware of any abuse of children, and therefore my child, if I ever have a child, will be totally open to being abused. They're
the two paths while I'm in denial.
While I'm in denial.
Of my own emotions.
The third option, obviously, is for me to heal it sexually, to heal myself sexually, heal the history of my own abuse. And when I heal the history of my own abuse, there is a much higher likelihood of my child never being abused, because I would instantly recognise the type of person who's the abuser rather than being afraid of them and going into my shell and trying to deny that they exist. Does that make sense?
Does that cover your question?
Yeah. Microphone. Okay.
Directly to what you just mentioned, we have a lot of cases now in Germany referring to the Roman Catholic Church that adults go into the open and talk about their sexual injuries they experience from priests. Would that help for the healing process? Of course, other priests, which are condemned right now and certainly don't look very nice, but the other ones, the victims, are speaking openly about what happened to them. I thought it is maybe a way to heal.
Definitely.
What is there underlying in the whole society.
Definitely. The truth is always the thing that leads to healing. Truth. The truth of what actually happened is always what leads to healing. So having victims who of incest able to speak openly and frankly about what's happened to them is a very powerful form of healing for them. They've got to be very careful, though, that they don't get into the cycle of just talking about what's happened without feeling the actual emotions, the underlying emotions about what happened. That's the thing they need to take care of. However, on the priest side, while the churches still protect priests from this whole process,
from the consequences of their actions,
the priests themselves cannot heal.
So you said they were condemned, and they are condemned by a lot of society, but they're actually almost condoned, like they're allowed to avoid responsibility for what they've actually done.
Yeah, Mary,
because
is right.
of the church.
And the other thing is that's what AJ said. They had no chance to heal because they are building up a block to hide beside because I think they're full of shame and they must have reasons for that.
Well, no, many of them are just full of rage initially and then other emotions. But while they're not isolated, placed in some kind of psychotherapy, working through the emotional reasons why they chose to harm children, while all of that's happening and that's not happening, then those priests and ministers have no chance to heal their problem. No chance at all. Now, some of them would be very resistive to that, of course. They'd be very resistive to having any form of that happening. However, in the spirit world, that's what's going to happen to them either way, right? Because the law of attraction in the spirit world works perfectly. And once those ministers get into a state where they acknowledge what they've done, from that moment on, they have a chance to heal. Now, any person who does not acknowledge what they've done needs to then be kept in isolation until they just acknowledge what they've done.
Because most of them are retired already. And most of these priests would have been accused of having done that are retired or about to be.
But they're not in isolation.
No, they're not in isolation.
Because the reality is many of them have not been placed in some kind of isolation where they can no longer harm children. They still have the desire in them to harm children, and they're in society where there are children, and yet they're not in isolation. They need to be placed in some form of isolation, but the isolation needs to be non-condemnatory and loving, where it helps them work through the emotional injuries. That's the sole purpose of the isolation. Helps them work through their emotional injuries until such a point as they no longer have the injury. When they no longer have the injury, then they can re-enter society and they'll be safe to be with because they'll actually have a desire for their soulmate rather than a desire to sexually abuse children. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think the people in Germany right now part much more with victims.
Yes.
And I thought it was a good idea that they're coming to the open because I think there are so many cases when victims do not speak. And all of a sudden they do speak up after 20 or 30 years. Yeah. And I was amazed about this like a volcano which is breaking, which is erupting, exactly, like things like this are erupting as well, so everything comes into the light.
Yes. The problem with society generally is that we as a society do not want to know about child abuse. We do not want to know, or even most of the time accept that it's actually happening. And the reality is it's happening in many families on this planet. You know, at least 1 in 3 families on this planet, in fact. So the reality is there's huge amounts of child abuse on the planet. And because there's so much about it, there are so many guilty people. And the reason why then we don't want to talk about it is because many people who feel guilty don't want to speak about it. And then many of the people who have been abused don't want to speak about it either because they feel ashamed and guilty. They feel like they've been to blame somehow. They don't really understand how, but that's the feeling that's present. And as a result of that, there is a huge amount of suppression of the truth about abuse on the planet. And that's what causes the shutdown of healing it.
I ask you a very personal question because I'm a teacher.
Y ahora es cuando esta mujer misma, que vemos que ha preguntado lo de Alemania, pregunta lo que vimos rápida, aquella pregunta rápida de que era profesora ella y que había visto casos de abuso, qué hacer y cosas así. Bueno, pues hasta aquí. Esta vez. Ya tenemos casi completado, menos una parte del final donde vuelve a comentar unas cosas de esta primera sesión, aunque luego hay una segunda sesión más breve. Hay 2 días. En un día hacen 2 y 2 horas, más o menos, aunque esta dura 2 horas y 40. Pero ya hemos visto casi todo con lo que finaliza esto. Y el día siguiente, que sería un domingo, pues creo que es menos de 2 horas. Y bueno.
Iván,
Sí.
Yo relacionaba este mecanismo, entre comillas, de justicia que tenemos, de hacer justicia, digamos, como en realidad es más de ampliar la condena, si se quiere, o sea, como que se posiciona paradójicamente más en la condena que en la justicia. Y siento que, claro, como vimos en el del libre albedrío, no restaura ni invita a asumir la responsabilidad justamente respecto de la emocionalidad que subyace, ¿no? Nosotros consideramos como humanidad, digamos, y de alguna forma son las leyes humanas las que operan desde ese lugar, incrementando las posibilidades potenciales de la réplica de estas circunstancias. O sea que lo que hacemos es justamente
como un terremoto.
Aumentarlas.
Aumentarlas. Bajarnos todavía más el foco del terremoto para que venga, para que haya más movimientos de culpa y de vergüenza, sí. La justicia.
Qué dolor, sí.
Va así. Las leyes humanas muchas veces. Y luego fíjate en los grupos del 2016 tienen ahí como 2 o 3 sesiones para hablar de eso, que ya lo comentamos así rápidamente, sobre todo lo que creemos muy profundamente, que depende de cómo son las leyes humanas y que solo proyectamos a las leyes de Dios, en las cuales estamos viviendo, lo queramos o no. Y sin querer, tenemos...
Claro, eso justamente yo rescataba en algún momento, lo dice él, sí o sí te vas a encontrar con la verdad, digamos, acá, o sea, lo que hacemos es, bueno, no quiero, ahí está Marisol, quiero escucharla, Marisol.
Sí, se oyen unos ruidos por ahí, ¿qué será?
No creo que sea mi ambiente, los ruidos. Simplemente, sí, nada más quería como, o sea, esta parte de sentir como esto que estoy sintiendo, ¿no? De esta información que estoy escuchando en relación a que esos mismos abusadores fueron niños que pudieron haber sido también abusados, y como no hubo el espacio, entonces ellos mismos terminan abusando. Es como toda una cadena que no termina de romperse, precisamente porque no le damos espacio a esa aflicción, a ese dolor y la pena, ¿no? De sentir, pues de sentir todo esto que es doloroso para todos. Y al contrario, es como en este castigo, en esta condenación, señalamiento, pues termina habiendo más enojo, y es otra emoción que va tapando, o sea, es como un cúmulo de emociones que se van tapando, y no hay manera, como dice Clau, de que se pueda romper la cadena, ¿no? Entonces tiene que ser como con mucha, como dice, con mucho amor el tratamiento, ¿no? Ahora sí que como dicen, el amor todo lo puede sanar, y a veces no entendemos la dimensión de abrirnos a la verdad, de que es amoroso, tenemos miedo a escuchar esas verdades. Por ejemplo, la palabra pecado, esta connotación, con toda la connotación de pecado que va muy asociado a la condenación y a la culpa, es como un círculo vicioso, ¿no? Y por eso no queremos escuchar la palabra pecado y asumirnos. y pues lo primero es eso, tener como la apertura y encontrar los espacios y las personas como adecuadas en donde podamos abrirnos también, ¿no? Confesarnos y poder sanarnos entre todos, porque es súper grave, o sea, no hay manera, como dice Clau, se sigue perpetuando y perpetuando la cadena de abuso. Y bueno, pues sí, lo estoy sintiendo y es muy fuerte, ¿no? Y pues nos toca hoy sentir la pena por eso y pedir más verdad.
Totalmente.
De alguna forma, Iván, como en un momento lo escuché decir a Jota, ustedes me dicen gracias, pero cruzan la puerta y de alguna manera dejan de sentir porque se van desintonizando con la verdad y el amor y entran de nuevo en la inercia. Pero siento muy profundamente una gratitud a mí en este momento, digo a vos como digo a todo lo que operó, a Dios básicamente, para encontrarme en esto. Mi hija sufrió un abuso y no lo digo desde la culpa, sino desde aunque no parezca, desde la oportunidad que tengo mediante la ley del perdón y el arrepentimiento de liberar, incluso quizás no sea ella, porque no sé cómo ella va a procesarlo, pero sí a mis otros, a mis descendientes, y a poder promover. Yo no sé qué tanto escuchan, ayer compartí, no suelo llevar al grupo de la familia porque es como que, bueno, quien quiera oír que oiga, pero ayer compartí el de la atracción sexual porque quedé muy sensibilizada con tanta belleza y como no tienen idea, digamos, no tenemos. Y esto, quería decirte gracias, pero es ese gracias que de alguna forma, digo, es traducido en una celebración con todo lo que implique sentir, la tristeza de no haber sabido.
Y una invitación a celebrar, que siempre tenemos que recordarla. Yo el primero, porque yo soy sorprendido cuando encuentro este material tan increíble que enseguida me acompañas muy pronto, tanto tú como Marisol, y, o sea que es súper de agradecer por todas partes, y es más bien lo que tú dices, ese gracias como un sentimiento conjunto de gracias a Dios y estas claridades, poco a poco, sí. Ahí
claro,
está.
que uno dice, él te cuenta lo que eres, digamos, esto de no poder vivir de no poder asumirnos, porque fíjate lo que sería un alma, no hablo ya incluso del alma gemela, hablo de la media alma en toda su potencia, inclusive, y cómo poder sentir quién podría perpetrar, o sea, poder anticipar. Qué maravilloso ese poder que uno tendría, ¿no? De no tener esta máscara, pero ser el yo real, y de poder proteger realmente, no sembrar el miedo que sembramos, porque lo que hacemos es sembrar el miedo, la culpa. Incluso mi hija tardó 6 años en contar, o sea, fíjate hasta dónde ella lo concibió como algo sucio, que imagínate la fuerza de conservar una niña esto, y cómo uno también de esto, yo imaginaba cuando él decía, si uno está sanado, uno puede anticipar y puede proteger realmente, y cómo creí en ese momento. Ella estaba en la casa de una familia que la cuidaba, porque yo trabajaba 3 turnos, y todo lo que nosotros pensamos que es amor y que hacemos bien, está totalmente distorsionado. Entonces digo, elegir en nuestra mínima expresión, que es prácticamente el cuerpo físico y en algunas ocasiones entra el espiritual, pero no llegar a tocar el alma y perdernos justamente de esta oportunidad de protegernos realmente, digamos, de sanar, de amarnos realmente, que es el propósito de toda la creación. O sea, es como que encontrás a Dios diciéndote por todos lados.
Sí, ya sí,
claro.
de que siempre tienes protección en realidad, aunque no lo parezca.
Sí,
pero ahora que has dicho eso, que no se me olvide comentar, sí, que has dicho lo de la sensibilidad del alma. Y yo me acuerdo que la cosa muy concreta que os conté del abuso sexual que tuve de pequeño con este hombre, yo recuerdo que debía ser bastante pequeño, pero me acompañaron porque no se fiaban mucho y yo en ese momento aún contaba las cosas. Y como era una cosa nueva, de que no me iba solo, tampoco me iba con los amigos, sino que me llevaba a alguien en un coche y no sé qué, me recuerdo que me acompañaron a donde me recogía este hombre, mi madre, no sé si también mi abuela, y recuerdo que la situación fue tensa, como que hubo miradas ahí como de donde noté como que mi madre sentía en el alma que tenía que ejercer de padre en ese sentido ahí. Los padres como que tienen más el papel de decir, no, esto sí más tajante, ¿no? Pero mis madres, mis dos madres, por así decir, siempre han sido como muy por un lado muy consentidoras, muy así, y para las cosas que he hecho bien está muy bien, pero para las que han salido mal o he hecho mal, pues tremendo, ¿no? Entonces recuerdo ahora que me la has recordado, ¿no? Y, o sea, de hecho, seguramente esto a lo mejor te sirva o sirva para recordar algunas veces donde realmente sí que teníais sensibilidad del alma, estabais dándoos cuenta de cosas como madres, pero no teníais ese punto de, por cómo son las heridas multigeneracionales con la mujer y eso, que ese punto de fuerza de decir, no, esto no, y vamos a ver qué hacemos.
Claro. A veces la misma lógica o vivir en una lógica que no nos permite darle pauta y darle como más valor al sentir, ¿no? A lo que tú estás sintiendo, porque hay algo que tú sí lo sientes, pero tu lógica te dice, pues no, o sea, no sería lógico, ¿no? Y al final es eso, entender los lenguajes, pues, de nuestra alma, ¿no? La manera en cómo nuestra alma se está comunicando todo el tiempo y como no sabemos que tenemos un alma o que somos un alma, principalmente, ¿no? Experimentándonos, pues decidimos toda esa información, esa interacción con nuestra alma. Entonces, sí.
Fíjate que con Dios, porque nos parece muy alejado lo del tema de Dios, pero ya vimos, ¿no? Para recordarte simplemente que es lo que dices, pero claro, recordando que nuestra alma está conectada todo el rato con Dios y el sentimiento de incomodidad, de ostras, ¿qué está pasando aquí? Esto no debería pasar, ¿no? Es directamente un órgano de comunicación de alma a alma con Dios. O sea, es que es muy fuerte, es demasiado inmediato, no lo conseguimos. Entonces, responder a esa relación es lo que se nos va bloqueando, sí. Pero fíjate como la relación en el sentido de la verdad, no del amor divino, como vimos, por ser pesado un poco repetirlo, ese sentido de la conciencia de la verdad de Dios está todo el rato.
Pues muy movidos con la información.
Sí. Y Ana Pilar se nos ha quedado muda.
Ahí habilité el audio, quería escucharlos y bueno, yo además de estar en la vida, antes de dedicarme a llorar, digamos, me quedo con esto de no juzgar el deseo, como decía Jota, sino que empezar a ver qué es lo que nos lleva a desear eso. No sé si me explico, ¿sí? Evitar el juzgar, sino que ir a fondo con esa emoción, como dice. generalmente lo que hacemos es condenar y como dicen también, no nos queremos hacer cargo de las circunstancias de abuso y por ahí uno es esto que decía Claudia, le pasó a mi hija, oh, qué tremendo, qué será lo que opera en ellos o en esa persona, la persona que es abusada y el que abusa, ¿no? Ahora como que asumo que uno también está relacionado con todo lo que no nos queremos hacer cargo, no queremos afrontar y que recién a partir de compartir esta herramienta por medio tuyo, Iván, recién se empiezan a correr los velos, como digo.
Sí, como que nos ha tocado empezar más fuerte ya sí o sí, a algo, ¿no? Y entonces en esto que dices me ha recordado el tema de luego cómo nos aseguramos, por así decir, en el progreso. O sea, como que la fe, que es eso, que no es nada subjetivo, sino que se basa en que realmente hemos experimentado ya que la vida nos responde, incluso en la oración, oyes más a lo mejor tu alma, por así decirlo, o tienes otros sentimientos, incluso recepción de amor divino, cuando se pide y se actúa en función de él luego también, pero, o sea, ¿cómo hacer para que eso es lo que puede ser muy interesante que lo vayamos ordenando, o hablando alguna vez, dando ejemplos, que ya lo hemos visto con la ley de la atracción? Por ejemplo, Claudia ha tenido ejemplos muy fuertes de cómo se le ha activado muy rápidamente la ley de la atracción, pero también en este sentido más continuo de esto, de lo que significa realmente la fe, ¿no? La fe en que realmente todas las leyes y Dios, el hecho de que seamos un alma en conexión continua con Dios, todo eso está actuando para bien. Y realmente irlo notando con un hecho concreto y, como por así decirlo, apuntárselo, ¿no? Por ejemplo, que Marisol sí que nos decía que llevaba un cuaderno, y luego también Claudia, más, creo que también Ana, de repente, ¿no? Como las ganas de... Entonces, no, bueno, que a lo mejor no hace falta, pero sí, en ese sentido, ¿no? De la fe tan práctica en ese sentido de las emociones, ¿no? De tener claridad en que realmente, ostras, sí, todo nos está, tanto sea en la oración como en la vida normal, nos está llevando a ver emociones que causaban o que causan atracciones para nosotros, nuestros hijos, lo que sea. Y ahí.
Sí, quizás, Iván, algo de eso sentí también. Ayer compartí un estado más o menos como un preámbulo para lo que va a ser el vivo en esta línea del amor por uno mismo. Todo está relacionado en definitiva, pero digo, bueno, como poniendo el foco en algo. Y puse al final que saqué de un texto de mi relación con Dios y bueno, hoy repite de nuevo en el esbozo que estaba mirando, de que básicamente el de la autodependencia, que en esto del autoconocimiento y ver, dice, de alguna manera, si nosotros creemos que lo vamos a hacer solos, por decir, yo me pongo a hacer supuesto y qué sé yo, es que eliminamos a Dios y que se nos ofrece todo el tiempo a través de la relación con Él. Y veía cómo aclaraba ahí en esa relación, en ese esbozo de la relación con Dios, un taller de agosto del 2008 de Miller, y él dice, bueno, que en realidad podemos pasarnos la vida tratando de aprender, entre comillas, o internalizar la verdad divina, pero que solo se trata de esto que vos decís, de las emociones y de estar conectado con lo que sentimos, y un poco también lo que trajo Ana al final de no juzgar, y de eso, de poder aceptar esa esa invitación que nos hace la emoción que tenemos y que siempre va a ser todo emocional, la verdad divina o como dice él, dice, bueno, la verdad de Dios o como ustedes decidan llamar, decía él. Yo lo llamo el camino o la manera, decía AJ, bueno, es realmente emocional, es totalmente emocional y veo que todo el tiempo cuando él pregunta siempre direcciona, viste, las respuestas y cómo es como que hay que hacer una curvita ahí, porque como que él te dice emocionalmente cuál sería la razón, como que trata de direccionar siempre hacia ese lugar. Y yo también tuve, bueno, muy fuerte mi máscara basada en la intelectualización con mi profesión y me protegí mucho de ese atributo. Así que a mí esa curvita me costaba hacer. Siempre era como que rápidamente establecer las causas y hacía una disección, decía un amigo, de cada caso, pero las emociones no estaban. Calculo que un poco de eso fue el cambio que pude tener, que por eso digo que empecé a los 49 a vivir desde ese lugar, a estar viva realmente, digamos, a sentir. A ser consciente de lo que siento. O sea, siempre sentí, pero nunca participé, nunca fui consciente de lo que sentía.
Sí, es fuerte. Sí.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a vosotras y despediros de, si queréis ya.
Gracias.
Ahora seguimos hablando un poco y dejo de grabar. Gracias, amado público. Despedidos.
Gracias, sí.
Que seguramente
Gracias.
1 millón de personas va a llegar hasta aquí.
Y van a compartir otro millón y vamos a desear, sí, que se multiplique.
Venga,
Sí.
pues lo dejo.